I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight to hear what will be and is an excellent panel on a very critical topic just before the State of the Union. So it underscores the importance of think tanks. This event is one of over 100 events taking place today in cities around the world. 175 organizations have locally developed, organized, and host events to explore in their context why think tanks matter. In the U.S., we have had an event this morning in Washington. There's an event here, obviously, in New York, San Francisco, Houston, and in Chicago. Institutions, and I was given a moment of pause because last Thursday, one of our partners in Kabul, Afghanistan, wrote to say that they had to cancel the program. I wrote back, and they said, you should take us off the list of organizations that are hosting. I wrote back to them because they were being kind since they could not host the program. I wrote back and said, you will remain on the list because it is important that in these difficult times you are recognized as a part of the global community of think tanks. For me, that underscores why this event and the other events are important. They're taking place in Mogadishu, in places far and wide where think tanks are making a difference, are important to policymakers, and more importantly to the public in the countries where they are operating, and in many cases, as is illustrated by Afghanistan, under very difficult circumstances. A group in Libya where individuals are threatened, their lives are threatened, their families are threatened, simply because they are thinking ideas that challenge the conventional wisdom and challenge policymakers to make a difference and to change policies often. So I appreciate your coming out tonight. I want to thank the Asia Society and the Asia Society Policy Institute for hosting this event. I consciously do an event in Washington and New York because they are totally different audiences, but both important and central to understanding why think tanks are important and why we should continue to engage with them. So without further ado, turn it over to the panel.
So thanks so much for coming tonight. I hope I can be heard. Very honored to be here with this distinguished panel, and as a journalist, I think there can be few more urgent questions than what facts are and why people believe that they exist, and what role people who try to analyze public policy can play in an era where not just domestically, because I think we tend to think of fake news as a Trumpian phenomenon, but actually if you look not only in the United States but around the world, facts are challenged by many different regimes and governments. And so what I think the urgent question that we should kick off and discuss is, when increasingly people seem to believe what they want to believe and to be legitimized in believing that, and to deny facts that are inconvenient from whatever political angle they come to you at, what role do think tanks have in trying to persuade people that there is analysis that exists that compiles evidence and recommends solutions that is credible? And so what I wanted to do is to ask the panels to address this sort of first existential question about, can you actually persuade people that what you produce is credible? And as a kind of corollary to that, how can you be transparent, a much overused word but an important one, about what the ideological preconceptions are that your institution brings to bear, or how can you maybe enhance credibility by saying clearly, I'm guided by this, or I am prompted by these sets of ideals that shape how I present this work. So if we can just have our panelists begin to toss that around. Stephen?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. It's a really challenging question now. I think we all agree that there is a necessity for rigorous research and analysis and evidence-based thinking about the major public policy challenges of our times. And yet, it's getting harder and harder to convince the broader public that that's even possible. And I think think tanks themselves, and I was a founder of one and worked in another, have a responsibility here not to hide their philosophical identity, but rather to be very, very transparent about it, to publish on their website a statement of values or principles or guiding philosophy, however you might want to phrase it. But they also have a responsibility to be reaching out to those who might not start from the same ideological or philosophical place. Because if we end up only speaking to those who share the same perspective to begin with, the value of the research and the value of the evidence gets degraded.
Right.
And so I think a lot of the responsibility of breaking through this culture of cynicism, culture of challenge, the culture of fake news, the anti-intellectual bias, the anti-scientific bias, is actually with those who are in the research world and in the think tank world. I think we have, and those of us who are funding these organizations, have a real responsibility to be on the leading edge of that work.
Right. And I should turn to Caroline for a moment and ask also in her role as, at Google, a dimension I might have mentioned to everyone, which is technology is increasingly, become almost a boogeyman in this whole discussion about how you believe and how we're in our bubbles and to what extent we can actually absorb information that seems undistorted. So if you want to include some perspective on that in your comment, it'd probably be helpful.
Well, just from the point of view of Google, obviously we're best known for search. Right. And our mission statement is, and our values are all around providing relevant information to as many people in a timely fashion as possible. And I think that is democratizing, but also it gives people an opportunity to search out facts and to listen to different points of view. In that sense, it's a bit different from some of the social media parts. True. But I think that we all have, as you know, I've been a policymaker, and I've also on the board of think tanks, and I completely agree with Stephen's view that it really is a responsibility of these think tanks, academic institutions. It's not quite the same for journalists, but to demonstrate and be clear about the work that they're doing. I also think that work is really important, and I wanted just to share something that a former colleague of mine told me about when puzzling through with a great political mastermind. Why is it that sometimes we're able to, in the United States, to deal with some big issues like healthcare, for example, and at other times we can't? And the answer, which I think is really true, is that you need to have a political moment, and you need to be smart about capturing that political moment. But even before that, you need to have some sort of worked through analysis that many people have had a chance to bat around, to discuss, to disagree with, to put other ideas on the table. And that process can take quite a while with a really difficult issue, but it's something that really needs to come through, or an enormously important role can be played by think tanks, and especially because of their linking between academics and and policymakers. And it's part of the wealth of the United States, and now increasingly around the world, that there are these institutions that are able to carry out that role. And it's incredibly important to safeguard their credibility.
Kevin.
Just 2 or 3 remarks. I think often our criticism of the integrity of think tanks, or the quality of think tanks, or the current utility of think tanks can often be, let's call it a first world problem. Mm-hmm. As Jim reminded us before, and his examples from Somalia, his examples from Afghanistan, there are parts of the world where there's been a long-standing dream to have anything resembling a think tank. That is, someone outside the official community of that particular country to have a creative idea about anything beyond the political orthodoxy of that country. So I think we who are in the think tank community need to reaffirm afresh that beyond our concerns, or if you're in Washington, well beyond the Beltway or well beyond continental United States, there's a wide world out there where having people who think creatively, laterally, and in unorthodox fashions about, let's call it, public policy in the broad, is a very good thing. And we should have in mind the importance of extending that culture and the wider role of civil society across the world. I think that's just a principle we should affirm from the get-go in our conversation here this evening. Second, though, and turning to the criticisms, is the essential distinction between fact and opinion. Now, this may seem superficial to many and something unworthy of our consideration here, but in a world of facts and alternative facts, we have to go back and return to some basics here. And that is that if we are going to have in, let's call it the collective democracies of the world, an open conversation about common public policy questions, international public policy questions, or domestic policy questions within them, then there are some grounds upon which we assemble evidence. One's called empiricism and the other one's called reason. And they actually they have reasonable pedigrees going back to the Enlightenment and been well defined since the days of Locke, Hume, Spinoza, and the rest of them, and Descartes. So it's been a pretty seminal debate in the evolution of this thing we call the civilization of the West. I find it odd in the 21st century we're having to revisit some of those premises, because unless we have a common epistemology of knowledge in how we conduct a public conversation, and to quote the great Australian philosophers, we're buggered from the outset. And so that means we're in trouble, by the way. So the reaffirmation that there are these things called objective facts, my apologies to the postmodernists and post-structuralists and the rest of them. But
don't keep pointing to me.
Sorry. Up there. Is that if we head down this relativization of everything vis-a-vis facts, we are in deep trouble as a civilization, quite apart from our claims to speak beyond the canon of Western civilization to others about facts which can be held to be existing and known and knowable through empiricism or reason, which then formed the building block for a conversation about opinion about those facts and what we do about them. Which brings me to a final point, which is opinion itself. I couldn't agree more with what's just been said about being upfront about, let's call it, opinion-related bias. That is, put up there in lights what the political, ideological, philosophical orientation of your particular institutional think tank happens to be. Are you progressive? Are you conservative? Are you Calathumpian? I made that word up, but
everybody was Googling it.
I know.
It's a distant province of Australia. No one's found yet. But the whole point is that it's something to be actually kind of loud and proud about, which is we actually come from that perspective. You might be a crazy bunch of civil libertarians who demand that there should be nothing in public policy to discourage anyone from smoking themselves to death. I actually have a slightly different view of that. but be out there and be loud and proud about that being your particular view. Therefore, within that frame, people understand the nature of the opinion-related debate which is then conducted. My final concluding observation is, having spent some time in government myself, both at a state level in Australia but also at a federal level, as Prime Minister and then as Foreign Minister, is, something, evidence-based policy is what those of us who are serious in the public policy process are screaming out for. Most of us have pretty good permanent bureaucracies, but even they, in this age of extraordinary policy complexity and rapidly evolving policy and let's call it environmental change in the broad, I mean the public policy environment is changing so rapidly, then your ability to have 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend against what piece of public policy actually works to deliver a given outcome against a given set of challenges, given this body of facts, is actually crucial. And therefore you are, as a practitioner myself, you are constantly on the hunt for a fresh idea for solving an old or a new problem.
Thank you so much. To build on that, a lot of you refer to the idea of being very clear. This is guided by a belief that the role of government or the role of the state or the role of the free market or whatever it guides how we look at evidence. It's been very fraught for a lot of think tanks, this question of whether research is funded by external donors who might have a particular point of view or interest to play. And in our discussion before we came out here, I think we had a very interesting back and forth about, it's important to be open about who funds you, but there are also some potential downsides for that, particularly when it's applied overseas, that we may not have contemplated. So as you've wrestled with this in your own institutions and when you're on boards or advising or funding the think tanks that you do, what have you come to see as best practices in order to try to establish this credibility in an age of such suspicion? And we can take any order in which you'd like.
I'm happy
Caroline.
to jump in just quickly, and I actually want to go back a little bit on what we were all saying about transparency of purpose, because I think, I'm on the board of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I would not say, and I was on the board of another sort of research institution, I don't think that they would want to espouse an ideology.
Right.
They would be transparent about the goal maybe of research, which is to understand better what conditions have led to this or that. But it's not always, I don't think, appropriate to think every think tank should say, I'm progressive, I'm, what's your word? Calathumpian, whatever. Because they may not...
So if you took Peterson just as a quick example, and I said, I probably misspoke, I don't mean ideological political view, it's basically your ethos. When I think of Peterson, I think of people who believe in open markets and free trade. Now, is that a known proposition? I'm not sure, but that's kind of where I'd see them coming from on most philosophical questions.
But I guess that they would also do research and have done research to look at questions about free trade. What's the impact of trade on different groups in society, or what has been? And I think that there would be, and I know there would be, an open-minded view about what it is that has driven different outcomes. So I think that's...
I also think they're brilliant, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. But what I do think is really important, so I think a mission statement is important, but it doesn't necessarily need to have that ideological basis. Going to your question, particularly, Susan, which I think is a really good one, and maybe Kevin can comment on the international part, but I do believe that transparency about funding is important, and that I think it's increasingly the case that think tanks aspire to have general funding as opposed to project funding, so that you can look at a specific issue or have a specific project, but that's funded more. Now that's at odds with the fact that many donors and philanthropists and others want to look at a specific project. And when I was on the board of a non-profit that looked at development issues for women and girls, some people wanted to fund issues that were about girls' education, and they may have had that from a philanthropic interest, but there's always the issue of how do you get general funding.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So as guilty as charged,
funder.
Yes.
As a funder, so two points. One is that with very few exceptions, we really encourage all of our grantee organizations to be completely transparent about the source of their funding. And we are also completely transparent about the people we give our funding to.
Right.
So it's on both sides of the equation. But there are some exceptions, and they get back to Jim's introduction about the group in Afghanistan, which I said to Jim as we were coming up here, may in fact be a grantee of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, because we fund some think tanks in Afghanistan who are under a great deal of risk. And in some contexts, just having funding from an organization like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund can put you at risk in a closed society or a closing society, or it can be a problem. So in those cases, we work with the organization to both try to help their security in the largest sense of that term, but also to negotiate the proper amount of transparency that doesn't put them at greater risk. And unfortunately, this is a problem we're facing in lots of places around the world these days. But in the context of the United States, I can't think of an exception that we have made to that rule, that we will be completely transparent, and we expect our grantees to be completely transparent. On the general operating support versus project support, this is a real challenge. And I would say, and I don't remember the exact data, but I would probably put it at about 1/3 of our grants are for general operating support, and the other 2/3 are for specific project support, often very broadly defined, but nevertheless specific project support. And that's because foundations are trying very hard to have significant impact in the fields in which they are working with pretty scarce resources.
Yeah.
And we're under, a fair amount of no doubt self-generated pressure to try to really have impact. And the only way we can do that is to say we're going to be very focused. And so our funding is going to go to a small number of issue areas, and we're going to try to really move the needle on those things, rather than say, gee, we love the Peterson Institute, they do great work, let's give them the money. But then what's how do you think about the value of those dollars in terms of, kind of not measurable, but at least identifiable impact? Mm-hmm. So that's a bit of a conundrum.
I was just I'd like to hear from Kevin, but I wanted to leap on this question of deliverable, for want of a better word, because this is something that I think is really interesting and probably affecting a great deal of how foundations and think tanks do their work, because I think there is this increasing demand for, well, what's a result? How can you show me that we had impact? And that then cascades back on this question of the ability of a think tank to be perceived as independent, or to not know what the outcome might be as they embark upon their research. Yeah. So I just wanted to raise that question, but also give room for Kevin to respond to the previous one. So,
yeah, well, I'd say on the question of, let's say, avoiding conflicts of interest and being perceived to be unfettered and not engaged in pay-to-play,
right.
I would say yay and amen to my two colleagues. And that is our approach at the Age of Society Policy Institute. Anyone who supports the Asia Society Policy Institute financially around our projects. It's specifically declared as such, and it should be. We have nothing to hide, and we never will. Otherwise, you ultimately simply see yourself undone vis-a-vis your credibility, not just within the think tank community, but more broadly in the general community. So anyone who's not doing that, I think, needs their head read. It's just dumb. So that's kind of premise number one, I think. On the question of, I'm partly diving back to the question of the values for which we stand, if not the ideology, if not the political orientation, the values, let's call it the mission statement, I think that was Carolyn's term. So let me give you a practical example of some dilemmas here. What's our mission statement? Our mission statement is that we are a think-do tank seeking to build bridges within and between the countries of Asia and between them and the United States to respond to the great political, security, economic and environmental challenges of our time, as well as the underlying conflicts of values which exist. That's a pretty big mission statement. But the key operational point is, and I've said this repeatedly in speeches around this country, is that we are not a classically American foreign policy think tank. We're bridge builders. And so therefore, if our mission statement was simply to go out there and almost subconsciously, as some think tanks do, take as their premise the US national interest.
Yeah.
We don't do that.
Right.
We consciously don't do that. Now, this creates a little dilemma for us, because if you're in the bridge building business, what you're saying is, okay, there's the American position over here. And much as I love Uncle Sam on X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C, Uncle Sam's position will not necessarily be universally virtuous. I hate to disappoint my American friends by saying that, and it will depend on the season. But even if you do think it's virtuous, the parallel discipline in our business, if you're bridge building, is to say, well, over here is the Chinese position.
Right.
Okay, and the Chinese position has X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C characteristics. It's on foreign policy, security policy, on human rights and values. And this is how they see the world, okay? Bang, 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 bang. I may disagree with that as well. And part of our mission statement here, which is a complex one, is, now, given all of that, how do we bridge the gap if you're into the business of common problem solving, whether it's on climate, whether it's on regional security, or whether it's on trying to keep the arteries of free trade and commerce going? And so what ends up happening is that we will cop it from both ends. Cop it? You understand what that means?
Take
So,
it.
take it. We'll get incomings.
Right, incoming.
Got that one?
Yeah.
From both ends as
I like
either
that.
being, in Beijing and parts of that part of the world as being far too close to the US foreign policy establishment. And then in Washington, you'll be seen as, yeah, but you had a forum the other day with a whole bunch of folks from the Chinese government on X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C. Well, our position is consistent with John D. Rockefeller, with Rockefeller III's mission, is to be the bridge builders, because there are very few think tanks who do that. But therefore, you will encounter a continuing criticism about our mission statement's interpretation of balance. It has nothing to do with funding sources about which we're transparent. But it does have a fair bit to do with perceptions of, as it were, openness to a range of views.
Well, I think just to pick up on that, I think, and I'm not trying to finger the Peterson Institute, where one of my dear colleagues is a key person, but I wonder sometimes. So you've been very transparent. I often think, as a journalist and as a former foreign editor of the Times, I had to be very careful to make sure I wasn't framing the coverage in terms of what American interests were. As you look at, how to look at a particular country, say, are you unconsciously evaluating it because you're kind of thinking, oh, I'm giving more coverage to that because there are American troops there? And I give this example only to say that, for example, for the Peterson Institute, there may be, in an age of populism in the United States, a certain almost unconscious sense that capitalism is an okay lens and we're not going to critique it. So in other words, I think sometimes, as you've been saying, the Chinese-American example, there may be preconceptions we don't even fully acknowledge if that's a fair comment. I don't know if it is, and I'm not trying to finger anyone institute, but I think it's an interesting one.
But I think that more generally, if we think of think tanks, I think Jim has pointed out, as policy-related research and analysis. Right. So it's not basic research that may be done in some university departments. It's trying to build a bridge from sort of academic study to policymakers. And I think it's then, policymakers have different interests, and I've worked both in an international organization and more in the American government. And obviously, if you're a policymaker in the American government or the Australian government, that is your basic responsibility. But you look to the think tanks, and the think tanks, I think, feel a responsibility, the good ones, to really try to build on evidence and facts and reason and debate and openness, and on putting forward ideas that can be useful in policy making. And that may be why we can see that in some places they're challenged politically, because that kind of openness and stimulation of debate is not welcomed. And I think that's a very important element of the think tank culture that we also should note. It's not just about presenting facts and evidence, it's also about providing a forum for expert debate and for knowledge dissemination.
Yeah, can I pick
please.
up on that point? I agree with Caroline quite passionately, actually, and I'm worried about this in the present moment. I do think that some American think tanks are now, because of the political moment that we're in, kind of feeling like they need to go to their corners, as opposed to coming, together in the middle. And I think we want this competition of ideas, and we want this debate. We want it based on rigorous analysis and on data and evidence, but then we want the ideas to come up against each other and be tested in the public sphere, and that's the way you get to better ideas and to solutions. And I worry now that because of the kind of political climate that we're living through, that people are, even in the think tank community, people are kind of feeling that they need to, be planting their flag and not budging from a particular place, and that ultimately is not very healthy.
Kevin,
by the way, I just point out, I thought your colleague Carol Giacomo wrote a very nice little editorial. What do you call them in the Times when
the editorial observer?
Yeah, the editorial. She wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago about Danielle Pletka at the American Enterprise Institute and Brian Catullis from the Center for American Progress, who have different views about a lot of public issues, but they really respect each other. And they've been going on the road together, having debates about important matters. And they really have made it their mission to have that kind of rigorous competition of the ideas in the public sphere. And
in a respectful manner.
In a very respectful manner, yeah.
Because in the age of pre-respect, which is pre-empiricism and pre-rationalism and pre-freedom of expression, we had different opinions, we just burnt each other at the stake.
Yeah, exactly.
It's much simpler. I often wonder whether people are seeking to return to that as well in the current environment. But the health of it may sound like a truism, but I think we need to bring it to the surface. The health of our collective democracies lies in the resuscitation of this simple separation of fact from opinion. There are two great contestations which should happen in public life. One is when we have different arguments concerning what constitutes the facts, and that needs to be resolved on a common grounds. And then there's a contestation of ideas which will be driven by different normative views.
Yeah.
But it's actually making that sort of pristine and clear, which I think is fundamental to the health of our discourse. Like I work in the foreign policy game primarily. I'm now looking at the questions of what's China's future worldview? and what's the current worldview of the United States? What is the current US-led world order, global order, regional order in Asia-Pacific? Is there a Chinese counter-view to that? Both of these are deeply normative propositions about where to take the region and the world. And so, I mean, my responsibility, as I see it, is underpinning all that, test as many facts as you can, what's happening actually on the ground in the South China Sea, what's happening on the ground in terms of, you know, the great cyber wars, but then drawing on civilizational traditions, if you like, and cultural traditions and different values traditions. What are these countries and civilizations now saying about their normative view about where they want to take things? And from our own perspective, is that acceptable? And to actually mount the argument in those terms. It's tricky stuff, but at least you've got to be clear about what the contestation is. Data, facts, opinion, counter-opinion, one set of normative values versus another, and just then have the debate.
Right. I was curious, you know, think tanks typically had, I'm assuming, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, as their intended audiences, governments, you know, public policymakers, a kind of elite expert audience, if you will. And I wonder if there's been any thinking about whether that audience, that traditional audience, needs to be broadened at a time when it just seems like, at least domestically, certain segments of the country have hunkered down in their, you know, ideological baggages, and that they kind of, people from the left and the right kind of repeat the conventional wisdom that suits them. I mean, is there a role for think tanks to broaden their reach or target audiences that are not as traditional, or is that not a good idea?
One of the comments that was made to me by somebody who works in a think tank, a different one from the other ones we discussed, was that they have noticed, but Washington-based, that they receive more queries from journalists than before, seeking some validation or some response about evidence and facts and so on. So I think, and that is obviously a way to broaden dissemination of ideas. And I guess that certainly in the United States, there is more of a, it's like with the rest of life, there is more of an outreach on videos. You know, we had at the beginning of, Tom mentioned at the beginning of the discussion tonight, you know, this is the hashtag, this is the handle. That, all of that is a way, in a way, that you can reach a broader audience. There's this explosion of interest in podcasts, which is another way to reach a broader audience. Now, whether how broad that audience is and how much demand and interest there is, I don't know, but I certainly think you make a good point that we want to be sharing information more broadly and democratizing that debate.
I think I agree with that. The question is, how can we? Go to the social media medium that you just referred to as the means by which to do it. I don't know how many of you saw George Soros' speech at Davos, sort of ripping into Facebook and everybody else.
Yeah, read about it.
And his thesis was, I thought, an interesting one, which is, it's about one we've heard many times before, the atomization, not just of opinion and the atomization of facts, but the atomization of our ability to actually conceive of, or to actually handle complex conversations because of what you guys have done to shred our attention spans. It's a pretty interesting sociological point that he's making.
It is.
As a political practitioner, myself in recent times, you know, we all know this, what was once the interesting 60-second long discussion in a television exchange becomes 30 seconds, becomes 7 seconds, becomes 3 seconds, until I remember one television journalist saying to me that the key thing was to get the public's attention span within the number of flashes of different images you see in your average effective Coke commercial. And I think we're now reduced to that, apparently so. That was before you guys came along. I was just dealing with the days of television. So there is there is this huge debate about not just, let's call it the Internet of everything, and how do we sort this and separate the sheep from the goats, fact from fact, and fact from opinion. But the other question is the ability to actually think and comprehend, which is a question about the future of the education system. Now let me attack your foes, which are the mainstream media, like the New York Times.
Go for it.
I like the Times, great newspaper. But let me just say something completely objective about the Murdoch media, which is when I look at the whole problem of where the debate about facts and alternative facts came from, you know, the way in which 20 or 30 years of evolution of Fox News in this country has happened is for me extraordinary from what used to be a general discourse, usually around common assumptions of facts in the American public political discourse, to one which is extraordinary in its convergence of fact and opinion on a continuing basis. And that in turn affects the rest of the mainstream establishment. I did an interview with CNN the other day on Trump's Davos address, okay? And so, you know, I watched Trump's Davos address. It was not inherently offensive. And I started by saying, well, look, given where the president's been in recent times, this is actually not a reasonable speech about the global competitiveness of American industry and the economy. And then began what I describe as the Foxization of a CNN interview, which is, oh, but Prime Minister, surely, da-da-da-da-da, you know, and I thought, hang on, I thought we were supposed to be just taking this, you know, analysing this in terms of his facts and his view of the world. So I think there is a degree of infection within the mainstream media as well. And finally, where does that leave us poor innocent civilians up the middle? And therefore, wherein lies the future? I think what I discover in my own country's politics, I can't speak of this country, is the crying need across voter groups is that they want independent, goes to your point, fact attestation on a rolling basis about the day's debates, including what the newspapers and other media sources are saying about the debates, which leads to the existential question, well, who evaluates that? And how is it evaluated and where is it put out? But people have this desperate hunger to know whether that factual assertion upon which this opinion is based is true or not. And how can that be done more systematically? And that's where I think think tank land, as you said before, comes in when you've got more and more journos ringing up and saying, are these facts right? Or where does this particular policy view sit within the general social science or economic science literature?
I do think it's interesting because, you know, there's kind of been an eruption of sort of fact-checking as a kind of mini industry, even in journalism, and I think that's a very interesting comment that there might be some role that think tanks could play to sort of assessing facts or assessing how policy is presented, I should say, and trying to adjudicate. It's a rather messy field, perhaps. I know maybe I'm not making a prescription, but it is. I think people are increasingly in doubt about how things are presented in the public sphere, and so you don't know if well, is that twisted in some ways? Are three key assumptions of that study left out because someone wants to make a particular point, or so on? I don't know that that's a role for think tanks per se, but it does seem like that's a big gap in our public debate. And so that sort of leads me to the wrap-up question before we take questions from the audience, which is, are all these trends that we've discussed, you know, technological change, political polarization, you know, increasing public cynicism and so on, have they posed any fundamental challenges to the way that think tanks have traditionally organized themselves or conceived of themselves? Or is it enough to say, no, our traditional ways of doing simply need to be reaffirmed?
Well, I think we are seeing some experimentation and some innovation in the ways that think tanks are organized. You know, if you kind of look broadly at the history of think tanks in America, there were really kind of three phases, and I think we're in a fourth. The first was in the progressive era, when kind of the first research institutes, public policy research institutes, were founded. The Brookings Institution being a key one in, I think, 2016. So that was kind of the first wave. The term think tank didn't get into usage until after the Second World War, when there was a proliferation of public policy research institutes, many driven by Cold War realities, and many in the national securities field, but then also because of the social programs of the 60s, more and more doing work on social and domestic issues. The third wave was in the 70s and 80s, when there was, in some ways, more of a proliferation of think tanks, and many of them more affiliated with politics. And I think the phase that we're in now is the less institutional style of think tank. I think we're going into a period where we're seeing more networks working together. And some of this started earlier. There's a very interesting think tank. They call themselves a think net, based in the UK, called the Center for Economic Policy Research.
Oh, yes.
And if you go to the headquarters of CEPR, there is nobody there doing any research. They're doing fundraising, they're doing communications work, they're doing outreach, they're doing program development. All the research is being done in a very decentralized fashion by fellows of the center who are based in universities or other institutions. And I think we're moving more to that kind of less formal institutional structure, more networked function that mirrors what's happening more broadly in our society. And I think that gets to your prior question too, which is, I do think that for democracies to be vibrant, we need an engaged and informed citizenry. And think tanks have a role to play in helping to inform the citizenry, helping them join the debate, challenge the assumptions, challenge the questions, but have more of the input coming from people who are working and thinking about public policy solutions available to them. So in that sense, broadening the audience, I think, is an important part of the work, and these networked models lend themselves to that, I think.
Would either of you like to comment before we open the floor?
One sentence, and that is the networked approach is exactly where we all must go for two sets of reasons. One is the crunching of financial resources for think tanks, particularly as we become more rigorous about the declaration of funding resources. And the number of high-spirited folks are going to say, public-spirited folks are going to say, here's $10 million, off you go. Frankly,
shrinking?
It's shrinking. Maybe it's just a problem in my own country and not here in the United States. So I think that's one element of it. And the second element is, and maybe I'm speaking more directly to what we do here, it is networking in the sense of, frankly, much more collaborative work with think tanks around the world against commonly defined policy problems, against common databases, where you then can test different values assumptions being brought into the debate. We've done one of those recently on the future of regional security architecture in East Asia, given the rise of China, the continued presence of the United States, and bringing, frankly, think tanks and participants from around the region on either side of that argument to a common table. Useful, but it's part of the networking phenomenon.
Yeah. Just maybe to play devil's advocate, I think that there has been an atomization in some ways, and certainly very large numbers when there were a lot of think tanks being established for specific either philanthropic goals or political ideologies. And maybe those, I think it would be good if there were more. There are so many, or there are enough big questions that affect many of us that bringing together a network of thinkers and researchers, I think, is certainly very valuable. I also think that there will remain a place for the institutions that bring together some of the more experts in a particular area. So the bridging of the Asia Society Policy Institute is a very specific thing. The centre, as you say, the CEPR has been around for a while, but is focused a lot on Europe and European. That's partly what makes the network make sense for them. I mean, they have the London headquarters, but Brussels, and so I do think one thing that's interesting goes to the international strain on some international think tanks. Are they helped or hurt by being a part of a network, or does that give them kind of a sense of solidarity and support, or make them more vulnerable to accusations of foreign interference, as in Egypt and other places?
Right.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for a very stimulating discussion, and we'd love to open questions to the floor. Could you please identify yourself and ask a question rather than make a statement, if at all possible? And if you have any particular panelist to direct it to, please do. Anyone? Sir.
My name is James Lewis. I'm with Cedar Mountain Management. And my question is directed to, it's general enough, I think, for the entire panel, but how much of this is an issue of journalistic integrity, and how much is maybe a counterintelligence issue, a foreign propaganda issue, versus something like funding and ideological issues with a news agency or something like that?
I guess my immediate reaction is it depends a little bit what the this is. If the this is a concern about fake news, then we obviously, we know a certain amount of in particular Russian funded, but other funded propaganda, and that's probably, not a new phenomenon, but it's showing in new ways. I think as far as the discussion we've been having, it's about the being transparent about funding, and I don't believe that there are think tanks that are particularly sort of part of that. Making sure that there are bodies that can, or there's an importance for, that I think all of us see, in there being sources of study that are looking for evidence and facts and reasoning to help inform policy making and decision making.
I think on the question of journalistic ethics and integrity, I think given the rapidly changing structure of, let's call it, journalism reporting and the media industry more broadly, there is a structural challenge. These guys, because it's still a large shop, say the New York Times,
Yes.
They maintain an infrastructure for that in terms of not just your fact-checking, but frankly journalistic ethics. Is someone ultimately guilty of taking bribes or incentives one way or the other from given corporation, given country, or whatever? What I worry about, given the atomization of news, is the million blogs out there is how on earth can this be enforced in terms of a collective journalistic ethic of the 21st century. This is, I think, a core challenge in terms of facts and alternative facts, and people's, in Western democracies, beginnings of public despair about the integrity of the democratic process. On your second point, which is when you've got foreign interference in domestic news or domestic opinion, I'm strongly of the view that each country has a responsibility to maintain, firm and clear counterintelligence laws, practices, and procedures when it comes to maintaining the integrity of your democratic institutions, including the media, including the freedom of the media. And that needs to be defined with a level of granularity and ability to enforce. Of course, at one end of that argument is a proposition that no media source in any particular country should be foreign-owned. Well, think about that for a moment in the current age in which we live. Is that any longer tenable? So if your media organs, new media, old media, future media, are multiply owned, how do we, frankly, manage that? We are in a radically changing and rapidly changing paradigm.
Fair enough. Sir, did you have your hand up? Yes.
Hi, good evening. My name is Yusuf.
Oh, sorry, just one sec. The microphone is here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, good evening. My name is Yusuf Bahami. Actually, I already participated at the Think Tanks Matters last year at the Asia Society. And my question last year was about the fact that the complete failure of the social media. And this debate today will add on to that factor a year later. Indeed, I think that also the think tank has been regressing towards the quantitative impact. I have witnessed several topics that are very repetitive, like on think tanks in Washington, D.C., and even here in New York in private think tanks. So they don't focus on qualitative aspect of the information. There is always an industrialized way of delivering the product, let's say, even the intellectual product. So how can we enforce, Prime Minister Rudd, the granular and tenable aspects in this matter, as you mentioned earlier, by having a steady narrative against the counter-narratives, for example? Thank you.
I'm not sure. Let me take one part of what you were saying. I'll throw it to the colleagues.
Sure.
I think what you were arguing in part was the imperative of producing the product. Is that correct?
It's related to that, yes. Yes, the ethic, the imperative from the ethics sense.
Ethical.
Well, ethics of an institution have to be reflected in our foundational documents, our mission statements, our internal protocols for enforcing rules of ethical conduct on the part of researchers and policy advisors, and in the integrity of our arrangements for full disclosure of our external funding. Beyond that, I'm not sure there's much can be done. Then you're down to, does the system work or not? And that ultimately will be assessed by the wider community. I don't think I can say much more than that.
Other questions? In the back, sir. Orange or pink salmon.
My name is Richard Penn. I used to be a lawyer.
Congratulations.
On both counts.
I mean, yeah, exactly.
Well done.
As a practical matter, if you hear a legislator, a congressman or a senator asserting a position that is wholly without factual basis, or reasonably without factual basis, as a think tank, do you take any affirmative steps with respect to that legislator in order to correct the factual basis upon which he's expresses his opinion?
Just in general, or do you mean if a politician is utilizing your product and then asserting things that are not factual, or?
No, he's establishing a legislative position.
Right.
And you know, factually, that it is ill-based. Do you take an affirmative step, like picking up the telephone and talking to him or her in order to persuade that legislator to take a position factually based?
I don't think there's any prohibition to doing so, and I think people in a variety of think tanks actually would do something like that. Probably do every day. Yeah.
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 I think once upon a time there used to be talking about the public political debate, there is a thing in Westminster parliaments, which is a fairly simple proposition, that the cardinal offence is to mislead the House. You mislead the House, you're actually in serious trouble. What I've noted to my individual and collective disgust over some decades is that the importance attached to that principle in many of our legislatures slides and slides and slides. I was rereading a debate actually this morning, a debate I had in Australia some time ago about the financial cost of introducing an emissions trading scheme in Australia, where then my opposite number, who was then the leader of the opposition, was running your classic conservative fear campaign against why you could never have an emissions trading scheme. The sky would fall in, the Russians would invade or whatever, but the key factual proposition was that this proposal would cost the Australian people $110 billion. This was in 2010. Okay, well, not all that long ago. It was just a completely absurd number. There was no empirical basis on it all. And I then actually took him to task in question time and said, "You've just misled the House. There's nothing within, any measurement tool available to the bureaucracy, to the think tanks, or anyone, which come within 10% of that number." But what I found interesting, and I think it's reflective more broadly of the state of our parliamentary democracies, this is just a collective shrug. Oh, okay, yeah, well, that's just kind of what politicians say, quote unquote. Now, unless that culture changes from the ground up and people are held account for just telling whoppers like that on their feet, then and you can't go and arrest them for doing it, then we do have a problem with the sickness of the system.
I think it's an important point, because one thing journalists try to do is sort of point out when things are blatantly untrue, and there's often a collective shrug on the part of our readers too. But sir, you had a question back there.
Yes, I'm Emmanuel Justima. I'm the co-chairman and president of Modri-Senir, a regional Caribbean Latin American think tank based in Haiti. My question is, it has to do with the example that advanced societies were giving prior to the muddy of the water, whereas facts and opinion converge, and you don't even know when one starts and where the other one begins. I understand that it is a debate in advanced societies, and they'll find a way, their way through it. But when in what is supposedly seen as less advanced societies, Western democracy were basically being held as a shining example of where you should actually start from a common ground, and then we can color it with whatever normative view that we have. Right now, what is in display in advanced societies is exactly the opposite. So people in less advanced societies were basically fighting to get actors to be rational and to start from, the civil discourse. You start with something from a common ground, with the facts that we can agree on, and then we can debate exactly depending on what our worldview is. Right now, we're basically regressing. So are there any interest in some of the think tanks in first world, quote unquote, to study the impact of what's going on, what is happening right now in advanced societies, and the impact that they have in democracies, or actually in the rule of law in less advanced societies?
I've spoken a fair bit. So.
Well, I don't know about specific examples, but I believe and expect that if we think about the work being done in think tanks, that places such as the Council on Foreign Relations and other institutions in the United States, and I'm sure in other countries, are looking at the impact of all of these sorts of debates across the globe. And obviously there's a lot of interest in the impact on society and economies and so on of the polarization of political debate and the lesser regard for facts and so on. Although I'm kind of heartened by the view, and Susan referred to this, that people actually have there are a lot of people out there that want some facts and analysis, and that's what think tanks are amongst the many that the institutions that need to be safeguarding and putting those forward.
I think that you're getting to a very, very big challenge that we're facing now, which is democracy in a lot of the advanced democracies, this one in particular, is in decline. And I think we are really in a democracy crisis. It is a domestic crisis in the United States, but it is a global crisis. And the decline of the really advanced democracies like our own only gives, fodder and succor and support to those in developing countries that really don't want democratic governance. They want to continue power politics, and they want to continue in power. And we're seeing this in reasonably advanced countries as well. Take what's happening in Hungary, where I worked in the 1990s as those countries were coming out of 40 years of communism, and when Viktor Orban, the now prime minister, was a champion of liberal democracy. And so now he proclaims, that proudly that Hungary is an illiberal democracy. And I'm not so sure it's a democracy. It's certainly illiberal. But I think the decline that we're participating in, we're permitting, we're allowing in the countries that have always been the beacons of democracy weakens the interests of others around the world in building democracy, in taking the risks, in engaging in the struggle to make democratic societies work, which is why we have to engage in that struggle here and now.
If I could just agree with that for a moment, this points to, I think, a central and serious dilemma, which goes to the basis of your question, which is, for the first time, I think, an open challenge, at least in the minds of those of us who come from the West, about the sustainability of the democratic project. And, I mean, I am a passionate Democrat, partly because I'm just a student of history. I know what the alternatives have represented over time, and they have been problematic. But when I look at the three great sort of coinciding crises or cancers of democracy at the moment, some may seem to be trivial, but in this country I think they're axiomatic. Redistricting. For God's sake, if you can't change the Congress because the gerrymanders are so steep in the House of Representatives, then that is not just a bit of kids' play. That's not just a bit of Tammany Hall gone wild. This actually means you can't vote the bums out, whoever the bums happen to be at a particular time. That's cancer number one. When I say to my friends in Washington, guys, this is kind of abnormal, I say, yeah, but Kevin, it just ain't going to change. I call that national learned helplessness. Number two is, since those dopes on the Supreme Court made it possible for there to be unlimited campaign finance in this democracy, then everything's for sale. And then you turn around and say to the folks in Washington, guys, this is just bad for the global democratic project. Yeah, Kevin, it ain't going to change. That's doubly national learned helplessness. And then we got the third one, which I think is not unrelated to the problems of the first and the second, because they produce perceptions of powerlessness and levels of corruption, which leads us to this new world of fact and alternative fact, that our ability even to discuss the above is now rendered increasingly redundant because we can't agree on the difference between fact and opinion. And when you have certain corporate interests up the middle of that, who have been in the distortion business for a long time. So I mean, as someone in the midst of this process, I feel a deep level of angst about our ability to come through it. I know China very well. I speak Chinese, I read Chinese. And what I know is, for example, just with the government shutdown the other day in Washington, not an example of any of the three above in particular, but some level of just general dysfunctionality, rendered as, in the People's Daily, as page one, as wide Western democracy has failed. Now, that happens on a regular basis now in the Chinese media. 10 years ago, it didn't. It was like buried up the back. But when you've got too many examples of stuff going really wrong, and the election of far-right parties who now form parts of governments in Europe, etc., then frankly, the world is saying to us, physician, heal thyself. And there's a lot of surgery to undergo. Do I sense the parallel sense of domestic crisis in this country about the state of your democracy, or for that matter in mine, where some of these cancers are alive as well? not all of them. I don't see that level of perceived crisis on the part of the political class itself. That's what worries me. Can we get through it? Of course we can. But it's going to take, I think, a new and invigorated reforming political generation to say, actually, this thing's starting to rock at its foundations. Then the authoritarian countermodel, which China talks about regularly, will simply be to see, well, this is a more efficient way of doing things. It may not be democratic, but then again, yours has ceased to be democratic as well. Think about it.
There's a woman in the back there.
Following up on George Soros's point, with the advent of Facebook, Twitter, people have a voice to say whatever they want to say instead of going to the polls to vote with their feet. How can we change that?
You can have compulsory voting like you do in Australia. We send you to jail if you don't vote.
That's true.
Well, I think there are still a lot of barriers to voting in this country, and we need to be in the business of taking them down. And unfortunately, what we're seeing around the country is actually building more barriers to voting. And we don't have, as everybody in this room knows, we don't have, a national voting system. We have 50 different voting systems. And in some states, it's even more than that because the voting systems are often decentralized even further to the cities and towns. So the rules for voting in one place can be completely different than the rules in other places. Some states have early voting, other states have no early voting, some have same-day registration, some have arcane rules that you've got to register 3 months before an election. And to think that we try to think of ourselves as a national democracy, and yet we have all of this variation in how we just administer the simple process of elections is a major problem. And we've got to be about taking down barriers to participation, opening up pathways so that it is easy for people to participate, and then we also have to provide the inspiration so that people feel like they want to participate because they think it's going to have an impact.
Right.
I think the main problem today, despite the barriers, I think the barriers are one thing, but I think the main problem is people don't think it has an impact.
I think you need a popular movement to bring about constitutional political change. It ain't going to come from above because it's too locked.
Exactly.
It's got to come from below. But of two simple propositions, which is a national voting system, where you've got common rules across the country which don't discriminate against minorities and everyone else in the way in which the dice are currently loaded. And secondly, on the question of redistricting, a common national petition for constitutional change, which places the drawing of electoral boundaries in the House of Representatives in the hands of an independent national bureaucratic commission. We've had that for 120 years in Australia. Anyone tries to interfere with it, you get shot, almost, but you certainly get put into jail. So no one has an argument in my country about whether the boundaries are fair. It's just bizarre that you've got that system here. But given what I get every time in Washington about the from above view, which is learned helplessness, it is only the informed citizenry in the great tradition of your republic that you can, frankly...
So the good news in this equation is that these movements are beginning to form. And, whether it's the Women's March, or the Movement for Black Lives Matter, or the March for Science, the climate movement, and these are all, more and more getting interwoven with each other in a kind of a broader movement for progress and justice. Just this coming weekend, I'm going to be speaking at a conference in New Orleans called the Unrig the System Summit. And it is amazing how many people have signed up to go to this conference. It's going to have more than 1,000 people, most of them grassroots activists.
That's really interesting.
Who are coming together to try to listen to people with ideas from think tanks and other places about how we can unrig the system from the gerrymandering, from the power of money, from the power of special interests and corporate power. And so I think it's beginning to happen. This is the one thing that gives me encouragement, is that the current moment, as distressing as it is also giving rise to the greatest civic impulse we have seen in this country probably in 30 or 40 years, maybe longer. And that is where the hope resides.
Jim, you had a question. I know we have so many people with their hands up.
The question is, Henry Kissinger described being a policymaker like being at the end of a fire hose. I think part of what embedded in the question or comment that you made is that we're all now at the end of a fire hose, partly driven by what I would describe as the increased velocity and volume of the information. And so it breeds insecurity. So the question, since a range of institutions are represented, how do your institutions respond to that very fundamental challenge? The other part is sort of connected to it in terms of what I see as the deinstitutionalization and the individualization, which is in some respects empowered by the web, which enables individuals to leapfrog, like Trump did in some respects, and others in terms of political problems, political parties, that basically individuals are empowered, there's increased velocity, insecurity, don't know where to turn. How do we deal with those interrelated issues?
I would just say on the increased velocity of information, I do believe that it's terrific if people can find out more information. And I think that's, and more people can. Information is not just the in the purview of the elites. There are obviously many other problems when, certainly as a policymaker, there's a flood of, I wouldn't say so much even information, it's a flood of events that drive, to which you have to react. And it's much better if you've had a chance or experience or can reach out to others that have to give you some ideas about how well to react to that. So I'm not sure that I buy into your premise that having more information is in itself problematic.
Yeah, I mean, that's not what I was saying. Basically what I was saying is that it requires, as Susan suggested, that people are uncertain and they're looking for institutions which may be a opportunity for think tanks, but it also creates a problem in terms of there's an erosion of trust because you don't know what information and who to trust, and you're looking for institutions, possibly think tanks, to sort of validate, as both the media and increasingly politicians go to think tanks to sort of say, what facts should I, trust? And that's what I'm talking about.
Would either of you care to make a comment?
Go ahead. Well, I think that it's a paradox, because I agree with Caroline. The amount of information that is now so readily accessible is actually a remarkable thing. Yeah. A wonderful thing. And I, on the other hand, I can sympathize with George Soros's concern about this. And here's the man whose whole life is about open societies. So it is very interesting that he is, in fact, criticizing the openness that is facilitated by all of this technology and networking. But he has legitimate concerns about it. So the question is, how do we, in democratic societies, I don't want to use the word regulate because that sounds very legalistic and worrisome, but how do we set the norms? How do we establish the right norms for navigating that and for adjudicating the validity and the value of it? And I think this is a debate we need to have, and I think it's very healthy that Mark Zuckerberg is now literally being, in a way, forced to have that discussion and deep re-examination of the model of Facebook. And I'm sure these conversations are going on every day at Google. How do these institutions that can be so inherently democratizing avoid the traps that they can also create that can be anti-democratic? And it is a really significant problem. But I think we don't want to destroy the extraordinary value of these mechanisms for disseminating information and providing access to information, because they are quite, transformative.
You're good?
I'm fine. I think.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm so sorry that we've run out of time, but really appreciate this enthusiastic participation from the audience, and I thank all the panelists for their smart and provocative thoughts. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And thank you for coming to the Age of Society. See you again next week.